Instagram Stories for Saturday, November 30th. I'm your host, Daniel Hill, and this is the weekend edition of the Instagram Stories. Today on the show, we're going to talk about Australia taking steps to ban social media for people under the age of 16, and we're going to talk about the upcoming TikTok ban in the United States and some recent news coverage that it's had. First, a word from our sponsor. Let's get into today's news, starting with Australia voting into law a social media ban for children under the age of 16. This legislation was approved by Australian lawmakers on Thursday and has the goal of protecting the mental health of children online. As you can probably guess, tech companies are putting up opposition to this, claiming that the rules the Australian government put into place are unworkable. This new law from the Australian government is scheduled to come into effect in 12 months, which gives social media companies time to meet the new requirements. These requirements include taking, quote, reasonable steps to prevent children who have not reached a minimum age from having accounts, end quote. Children who violate these upcoming restrictions won't face punishment, and their parents won't either. The responsibility is going to be squarely on the shoulders of the platform providers. The Australian Prime Minister gave an interesting quote. He said, quote, "We want Australian children to have a childhood, and we want parents to know the government is in their corner. We know some kids will find workarounds, but we're sending a message to social media companies to clean up their act," end quote. There are some interesting points in the legislation that I want to highlight. First, the specific platforms that we know and love have not been named in the law, but it's likely that they're going to apply to Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and TikTok. However, certain sites used for education, like YouTube, would be exempt, as well as messaging apps like WhatsApp. I find it hard to differentiate between WhatsApp and Snapchat sometimes. How are they not social media in the same way? I'm not 100% sure. I will leave that to the Australian government to determine. The legislation also doesn't specify how tech companies will enforce the new age restrictions, but those that fail to do so would face fines of up to $30 million US. The law does not require users to upload government IDs as part of the verification process. This part confuses me, because how will you know for a fact that the people who are creating accounts are under the age of 16? The response from the social media platforms themselves was as you would likely expect. Meta criticized the bill when it was introduced in the Australian Parliament last week, calling it, quote, inconsistent and ineffective. The company urged the Australian government to delay passing the legislation, citing, quote, uncertainty surrounding the reasonable steps that need to be taken for the platforms to enforce the rules. Elon Musk also slammed the law, alleging that it seems like, quote, a backdoor way to control access to the internet by all Australians, end quote. Okay, we are going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the upcoming TikTok ban in the United States, which potentially is supposed to be January 19th, and some media coverage of that. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Recently, the HBO show Last Week Tonight did a 27-minute segment on the TikTok ban. The host, John Oliver, shared a ton of reference information backing up the points that he was making about the controversy surrounding this issue, and he explained it incredibly well. I will say that all the points that he raised are things that I've talked about on this show in the past, but since he has a whole team of staff writers, the way he presented it was a much more cohesive way than I've done it on this show in the past. So I wanted to include some of the clips from his episode. Let's start with a brief clip from the intro of the show talking about why this issue is so important.
Nearly 40% of adults under 30 say they regularly get their news from TikTok, and it's a significant driver of business given that more than 7 million small businesses use it. And yet, some lawmakers insist it's also among the biggest threats facing our nation.
TikTok is a grave national security threat to Americans.
TikTok is just Chinese malware. It's just junk food for our brains.
It is spyware. It is being weaponized.
TikTok is a gun aimed at Americans' heads.
Yeah, those are some strong words, because we all know Congress will not stand by and watch someone pointing a metaphorical gun at Americans' heads. Actual guns, that's a complicated issue for some reason, but metaphorical gun violence will not stand. So if an app this popular is supposedly such a dire threat, tonight, let's look at TikTok. Who's behind it, what the concerns are, and what this might really be all about, because this story is actually a lot more nuanced than you might think.
At this point, John Oliver explains the history of the issue, which is really important to understand.
But lawmakers were already raising alarms about TikTok being Chinese-owned. And by mid-2020, Trump signed an executive order banning it, saying TikTok would be shut down unless Microsoft or another company purchased it from ByteDance. That never wound up happening, as a court found that Trump had overstepped in trying to ban it by executive order. And in the years since, TikTok's been at pains to publicly distance itself from China. It launched something called Project Texas, where they basically promised to store US users' data on US servers maintained by a third-party US company, which might sound good, but there are real questions about how effective that has been, with one worker saying the data protections amount to basically a wink and a nod.
Okay, I'm just going to stop this clip for a second and say that I actually did not remember reading this article in the past. Not sure that I've ever seen it before. It is from the Wall Street Journal, and the title is TikTok Struggles to Protect U.S. Data from its China Parent. The byline, video sharing app says it has walled off American data, but employees say data is sometimes still shared with its China-based parent. I looked for the quote that John Oliver had mentioned there, and I do see it in the article. It says, quote, now many of the Project Texas data protections have devolved into what one employee called, quote, a wink and a nod. Other employees say Project Texas officially still prohibits users sharing data except in rare instances, but the instructions some employees receive conflict with that stance, end quote. I'm going to link to this article in the show notes so you can read it for yourself, but here's more from John Oliver.
But despite those efforts, concern about China's influence over TikTok continue to grow, culminating in the law passed earlier this year demanding it be sold or banned from app stores in the US. A law, by the way, that passed the House 352 to 65. And it's worth talking about the government's two main concerns here: the data TikTok is collecting from its users and the power it has to push content to them. And let's start with the data. TikTok is powered by an algorithm that tracks things like what videos you skip past and which you linger on. That way it can quickly figure out exactly what you like and feed you more of the same thing over and over again. Not unlike a doting grandmother or Marvel Studios.
Okay, so now that you have that context, in the next clip, John Oliver explains how the TikTok algorithm works. This is something I've discussed on this show countless times, and also why people are so afraid of TikTok.
The algorithm is incredibly powerful because you're constantly feeding it new data. Every interaction you have with a video trains it more on your preferences, and because those videos are so short, it can gather a lot of data about you very quickly. But that is not all the information it gathers. It knows the device that you're using, your location, IP address, search history, the content of your messages, what you're viewing and for how long. It also infers factors such as your age range, gender and interests. And in the US, its own privacy policy says it may collect biometric information, including face and voice prints, from any content you post. That is a lot of personal information. And some of TikTok's critics paint an alarming picture of what that means. Basically, the concern is that all this data could one day be used by the Chinese government to identify intelligence opportunities, for example, by helping China uncover the vices, predilections, or pressure points of a potential spy recruit or blackmail target. And I mean, maybe? I guess there's a non-zero chance a future US president is currently running a fan account devoted to Sonic the Hedgehog's feet, which could be weaponized against them in the future, though it is worth noting a huge component of blackmail requires shame. And if you're not on TikTok, you are missing out on just how little shame its users have. There is an entire challenge that just consists of naming your biggest traumas for all the world to hear while dumping candy into a bowl, and it is riveting.
And this is the part that I think is so important. John Oliver explains that there is no evidence that the Chinese government has ever gotten any information from TikTok. In case you don't believe me, here's the clip.
TikTok insists it hasn't and wouldn't give data to China, but whether or not you believe them, there is still no public evidence the Chinese government has actually spied on people through TikTok. What's more, while it does collect a lot of data on its users, as we discussed in our Data Brokers story, lots of other apps do the exact same thing. In fact, when the Washington Post worked with a privacy researcher to look under the hood at TikTok, they concluded that it doesn't appear to collect any more data than your typical mainstream social network. For instance, while TikTok is tracking users around the internet even when they aren't using the app, the same tracking tool is used by Meta and Google on a far larger scale. And even when it comes to tracking reporters, TikTok is not an outlier, given an Uber executive once used an internal tool named GodView to track the location of a BuzzFeed news reporter who was covering the company. And again, I am not giving TikTok a pass here. I'm just pointing out that its behaviour is pretty consistent with Silicon Valley's own standards.
And that part right there, what he just mentioned about how TikTok operates exactly the same as all the other apps that you have on your phone, is really the key thing to remember. Okay, that's it for the news portion of the show. Now let's go into a request. A listener wrote in asking for an episode with data about how to optimize social media strategies over the holidays. During the holiday time, the listener noted that there are massive shifts in engagement patterns, viewership interests, and other topics that the person would like to hear covered on this show. Is that something that you personally can speak to? If you are listening and you have thoughts about how to optimize your social media strategies over the holidays, could you please get in touch with me? I would like to collaborate on an episode and have you share your expertise with the audience listening to this podcast. Send me a direct message at Daniel Hill Media. That's it for today's episode. Be sure to come back next time for more social media news, strategy, and other things that you need to know.
Let me tell you a couple things that you should know about me. A product manager, but do not have a bachelor's degree. But actually, that's factually a fraction of me. And other fractions posting content irregular and irrationally. Still probably won't get a job at the Gram. They forgot, they don't know, or don't care who I am. That's why you never see me at the parties and events. My lack of followers must make me irrelevant. Don't have a course, a book to sell to make a bag of grand. Not a social media marketer, don't represent any brands. Plain to see, don't have an agency, but I got a lot of spam. Just putting in my work without the glitz and glam. Won't catch me eating fish unless it's shrimp or clam. No six pack, no risk that there's a gym card in my hand. Don't have a full-time job, but I got a lot of plans. Stay plotting, dropping knowledge on TikTok and Instagram.